And he's so distraught. He's so upset. He hasn't been sleeping. That's what we call for your notes sleep deprivation. He probably hasn't been eating. And so his spirits, his mental state is very edgy, and he's starting now to lose his mind. And his health obviously is going along with it in the mix. How you read the poem is kind of up to you. Notice the genius of Poe. He gives you an opportunity either way to be able to read the poem. Either way, though, it does lead us to the final stanza, so let's go there now. And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting, and let's point out, wait a minute, we've got a shift. The tense is shifted. We're no longer in the past tense, right? Go back to the opening lines. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary. Past tense. In other words, dude, let me tell you what happened one night long ago. But then all of a sudden you realize, oh, it's the same night. In other words, now all of a sudden he's writing. We've gone, put it in your notes, from reading to writing. Right? We've gone from reading to writing. In other words, he's been writing this poem. He's trying to explain what happened earlier this evening. Put it in your notes at 2B. This is a narrative poem. It tells a story. It narrates a story. It's a bizarre story. It's a whacked out story, but it is a story. And what happened in the story? Bird showed up. Asked the bird, what about my girl Lenore? The bird said, you're never going to see her again. She's jacked. And then I threw a cushion at the bird and said, what do you know about it? I need you to get out of here. The bird refused to leave. Now all of a sudden we're to the end, and we're writing in the present tense. And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting, notice the repetitions, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon that is dreaming. And the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted evermore. Well, to understand what happens here, we've got to jump up to the stanza right above it. And of course, there is his last words actually to the raven. And he says it, take thy beak from out my heart, and take thy form from off my door. Now, we got to be careful here that we don't misread, okay? When we learn to read, we have to be able to read it both the literal and at the figurative level. I once had a freshman that said, oh, I get it. Okay, I get it. So in other words, he dies because the raven jumps onto his chest and eats at his heart. Eats out his heart. Well, this is an interesting reading of the poem, and there's no question that Poe wants us to give some thought to that ancient Greek story of Prometheus. So let's make sure we put that one in our notes. Prometheus is the famous god, the Titan, who will free humans by giving them fire, and for this is punished by Zeus, you'll remember, and a vulture or a buzzard or an eagle, different versions of the story, will eat at his liver out every day, and then it grows back. Even in some versions of the story, it's not his liver, it's his heart, depending, again, on how modern the text is that you're reading from. Either way, we've got the same day being played. Hey guys, the raven doesn't jack his heart physically, but rather the beak of the raven goes into his heart, ergo, in the words, you're never going to see your girl again, Lenore is gone. So what happens at the end in regards to his soul floating above the floor? And this, obviously, the answer is he will die at the end of the poem. From what? That's the question. Some will qualify it as exhaustion. Some will qualify it as suicide. However you read the poem, it's clear that at the very end of the poem, he is still. Right? So in other words, the poem ends as a poem of death. So let's begin begin where we end here and end where we began. Notice how the poem is then written in kind of a circle of a type, right? At the very beginning, he tells us, I was reading tonight, trying to get my mind off of a terrible thing that just happened to me. We don't necessarily know what early on, and then we find out, oh, he's recently lost the one he loves. Now, of course, many have pointed out that Poe himself struggled with something similar. He lost the girl he loved, and he had to come to terms with it, and it destroyed, many argue, his life. if you want to read the biography closer, you can join me in my junior lectures to hear this in more detail. Everybody that Poe loved pretty much died. After a while, you would start to think maybe it's your fault, or there's some relationship to that. That is to say, you'd start to take it personal. Many have seen The Raven as Poe's classic statement about what it means to grieve. So let's jump now to 2A. This is a poem, of course, about grieving, no question. It's a poem about trying to come to terms with the really terrible stuff that happens in life. Poe will suggest it ain't easy, right? It ain't easy. And let's say it this way as well, as a possible message. If you don't get help, you can begin to have serious problems, psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, as you begin to deal with the grieving that is natural when you lose someone that you care a lot about. At level 2B, we told you that we would pay attention to the rhythms and the diction of this poem. I've had students that say, I love the rhythms of this poem. By the way, let's go ahead and say what I said earlier in an earlier lecture. There are some who say Poe killed rhyme. That poets after Edgar Allan Poe could never legitimately use rhyme because people saw it as too simpleton, too sophomoric, too simplistic, and the like, right? The rhythms, we would say, sometimes the same. Poe is the genius. It's almost like he's the Van Gogh of this kind of writing and poetry. You just can't, nobody can do it any better, and so pretty much poets just kind of stayed away from it. But the question is obviously, what is going on with all the sounds? I'll point out the two already. Notice the or sound, or. And the ing sound, ing, over and over and over again. The poem starts to sound almost like a spell or a mantra that's getting recited over and over and over again. And it can have a haunting kind of presence, right? By the way, a haunted house is actually mentioned at the end of the poem. I'll let you find it on your own. Poe is famous for his fall of the House of Usher and the notion of a haunted house. The house, he believes in the poem, the house is beginning to kind of be haunted. At 3A, we can ask this question about how this poem maybe relates to the other poems in this collection. Notice, they put this poem together with the writer. Why? Well, quickly you will say, they're both about birds. You're right, good one, good one. Can you come up with any other reasons why these two poems are put together? Okay, well let me throw another one at you. How about Edwin Murr's The Horses? What's going on there? And of course, quickly we can say it's very simple. In all three of these poems, the animal that's there is in some ways related to the human that is there in symbolic ways. For example, the horses in Murr's poem represents the future as well as the past, the new beginnings. Right? The bird, the starling, represents the art of creativity. And of course, in the third poem, most famously, the raven represents death, doesn't it, right? And the challenges of dealing with death. Of course, at 3B, I mean, there's all kinds of questions about this. Let me just ask you two. One, I'll ask you a question about the poem, and then I'll ask you a question that extrapolates from the poem. Two questions. One, what about this poem do you like the most, if you like it? What about this poem haunts you, right? What about this poem bugs you? I've had students that say, I've heard this poem a number of times, and now it's starting to bug me a little bit. Why? What bugs you? What is attractive about this poem to you? And then secondly, let's ask a more personal question. How do you deal with death? The death of one you care about? When you love? How do you go through the grieving process? What is a healthy way to do it? I mean, we obviously have an unhealthy way here, right, represented for us. What's a healthy way to deal with that? Well, there you go, an introduction to a poem we'll come back to again in your junior year. Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. Thank you.